If you want a serious analysis of the threat posed by the climate crisis and what we need to do to address it, it's long been a safe place. You could find that in the writings of Naomi Klein. And starting today, we've got an especially good example of that. The new book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, on sale starting today. And joining us now to discuss, author Naomi Klein. Welcome back to the show.
Happy to be with you.
Happy to have you here, especially on the launch of your most recent book. Very exciting topics I'd like to get into. Can you tell us what differentiates this most recent book from some of your past writings on climate?
Well, it is focused on the need for a Green New Deal, as the subtitle suggests. The first book I wrote about climate change ran close to 600 pages, 70 pages of endnotes. It was a really comprehensive case for why we needed transformative action and how we got to this dangerous place. This book is a lot more accessible, honestly. It's essays that are some of them personal, but also very practical in terms of how to win an argument for a Green New Deal with maybe a resistant relative or friend who's telling you it's too expensive, it's not practical, and so on. And it really takes the lead and begins with the student climate strikes, which we're going to see more examples of in a couple of days, and the kind of existential urgency that young people are bringing to this crisis.
I've been very excited to see throughout the year, there's been a lot of conversation about the Green New Deal, but there's also been a lot of misinformation, not all of it coming from people who are climate deniers. To you, when you hear people talk about the Green New Deal, maybe they talk about their climate proposal, which isn't necessarily actually the Green New Deal, but they like that label. What do you think people need to know about the plan to understand what it should actually be to accomplish its goals?
Right. Well, I think first of all, it's important that it be guided by the best science, right? In the resolution put forward by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, it begins with the science and the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that told us a year ago that we had 12 years to cut global emissions in half. So anybody who says they have a Green New Deal or any kind of climate plan, we have to be very clear that they actually have a plan to meet those targets, right? And they also have mechanisms to keep themselves honest, right? To make sure that they don't blow our carbon budget. But what really sets the Green New Deal apart is that it puts economic justice, racial justice at the center, right? So it's not only about lowering emissions in line with science, it's also about battling poverty and economic exclusion, including historical exclusions that were very much reflected in the original New Deal. So I think in some ways what we need to be looking at is who has a real story of transformation, right? It is not just a collection of policies. We're talking about mapping the next economy.
Exactly. You alluded to the fact that there are these different proposals, and certainly, amongst the Democratic primary contenders, there's quite a few climate proposals. Are there any that stand out to you as being grounded in the best science that seem to take the Green New Deal most seriously?
Well, look, I think that that Warren and Sanders have the most ambitious plans. Warren, took a lot of her climate plan from Governor Inslee, who ran on a very bold climate platform, and there was a lot of input into that plan from climate justice organizers in Washington State and across the country. Bernie Sanders' plan is more ambitious, just in terms of the money on the table. It's significantly greater than what Warren is talking about. But I think for me, even more importantly, what is critical about the Sanders plan, and I do think this is something that Warren needs to be pushed on, has to do with a more internationalist focus when it comes to the Sanders plan. He's talking about putting he's talking about putting $200 billion into the UN Climate Fund, so that it really recognizes that the U.S. cannot lead on this just by example. The US is the world's largest historical emitter, and that means that we actually owe a debt to the countries on the front lines of climate impacts who did the least to create the crisis. And we aren't going to get where we need to go unless we're willing to help poorer countries keep carbon in the ground by leapfrogging to clean tech, to renewable energy, and also helping them deal with the impacts of climate change that are already upon them. And I think if the U.S. does not live up to its duties under different UN climate conventions, then it's not going to be taken seriously as a leader, and it isn't going to have that catalyzing effect. So I think that's pretty important. There's also different approaches to the military that are really critical. I think Bernie's been the one who has most forcefully made the connections between military conflict and climate change. The fact that so many of the wars that we fight are in oil-rich regions, and that's not by happenstance. Mm-hmm. Whereas Warren is talking a little more about sort of greening the military. So these are some sharp differences that I think people need to pay attention to.
Well, and I think this week is a great example of that difference. I mean, there is a possibility that we could launch some sort of attack against Iran to defend Saudi oil facilities, which is almost perfectly an example of something that you talk about quite often in terms of climate.
Yeah, and I mean, these issues are so interrelated, and it's one of the things that I find frustrating watching the Democratic primaries. I mean, I agree with Sunrise 100% that we needed a climate debate, an official climate debate, where all of the top candidates are on stage together, and we're able to really contrast their climate plans. But in the absence of that, we also need candidates who talk about the Green New Deal, no matter what question they're asked. I mean, I think we're still very much in this paradigm where you talk about climate change when you're asked about climate change, as opposed to really weaving it organically into your whole economic program. Because if we really are drawing inspiration from FDR's original New Deal, that was not a singular job creation program. It was his framework for governing for a decade. And that is what we need in the face of the climate crisis if we are indeed going to transform our energy system in the very short timeline that we have. We know that we need to, radically change where we get our energy, how we live in cities. It's impacting housing, agriculture, transportation, all of it, right? So you don't need to be asked about climate change to talk about your plan for getting to a zero carbon economy.
Here on the Damage Report, we talk a lot about the big banks and their ways of getting rich off the poor. They saturate the market, but there are other options. And I've got info on a socially and environmentally responsible financial institution that has no ATM fees, gives you cash back on every purchase. They even commit 10% of their earnings to charity. It's called Aspiration, and if you go to aspiration.com/TYT to sign up, you'll get these perks, and that's more money to spend or to save or to spend. Just treat yourself.